Algebra 2, today's learning targets are 3 learning targets, and it is that I can define a polynomial function given its zeros. I can determine a factored form of a polynomial expression from x-intercepts, and I can identify zeros of multiplicity greater than 1 and describe the effect of those zeros on the graph of the function. Okay, the first part of these notes is just remembering back to last unit and how we can find roots or zeros of a quadratic function. When you're given an equation, remember our steps, and these steps are not written in, so first write in the steps. Step 1 is factor. Step 2 is set the factors equal to 0, and step 3 is solve for x. Now we're going to factor our function. So if I rewrite our function, 2x squared minus 9x plus 10, remember you can use logic here to factor, or slide and divide, or grouping, whatever your favorite method is. I'm going to go ahead and show logic since 2 here is a prime number. It doesn't make it too difficult. And my options then I'm doing reverse FOIL or reverse box, and my options to break up 2x squared would be 2x and x. Now remember, when we put our two last terms, these two numbers need to multiply to 10, and they also, when you've placed them there, they need to end up working out with the other factors to eventually add up to negative 9x. So my options for 10 could be 10 and 1, or negative 10 or negative 1, or 5 and 2, and negative 5 and negative 2. So these are all the options for how you could multiply to get 10. So we have basically 4 different options here, and within these options we could place the two numbers in 2 different spots. But right away I can already eliminate 2 of these options. If you notice that this is a negative 9, then you know our factors would have to be the negative options here for it to eventually add up to a negative number here. So we can cross out those 2 factors, and then we only have a couple here to try. Go ahead and pause the video and try that and see if you can factor the rest of this equation using logic. Okay, so the only option of these 2 that would work is if you place the negative 5 here and the negative 2 here. Because if I multiply this out, it'd be negative 5x, and then our outer terms out, it'd be negative 4x. So negative 4x and negative 5x would equal negative 9x. Okay, so our first step is factor. Then now we're going to set our 2 factors equal to 0. So remember, we are finding our zeros, so the y value would have to equal 0. So up here, remember this was equal to y. Remember, f of x is another way to write y. And now we're going to set our factors equal to 0, because any x-intercept or 0 would have to have a y value of 0. So we'll set both factors equal to 0. Up here have a little more room, so I'll just show that. And then here in my step 2, I'll set each factor equal to 0. So 2x minus 5 equals 0, and x minus 2 equals 0. So that's using the zero product property. If this is 0, the entire item will be 0, or if this factor is 0, the whole thing will be 0. Now you're going to solve for x. So when we solve 2x minus 5 equals 0, we first have to add 5 to both sides, and then we get 2x equals 5. Then we still have to get x by itself, so we're going to divide both by 2. So that would cancel these 2's, and x would be equal to 5/2 or 2.5 or 2.5, depending on how you'd like to look at it. Our second factor is pretty simple. All we have to do to solve for x is add 2 to both sides, and our x would be 2. So our two zeros in this case are 2 and 2.5. Okay, so remember, roots or zeros, that's how we find them. Now we're going to take this to the next step and learn how to do it in reverse. So if we are given roots, we're going to follow these steps, these 4 steps, to then come up with the original equation. So we're just going to be doing what we know in reverse now. We could be given the roots in words, or we can be given the zeros in a picture, and you have to pull out what the values are. So our first step would be to write down what the roots are, or pick them out of the graph if they don't tell us exactly. So in this case, our roots were given to us as 3 and -2. Our step number 2 is going to be write as a solution. So this part you'll need to write in. So if it was 3 and -2, then we write it as x equals 3 and x equals -2. Now we're going to write them as factors. So we have to write them where now this is set equal to 0. So we'd have to subtract 3 from both sides to make this equal to 0. So we'd have x minus 3 equals 0. That would be one factor. And here, this factor, we actually would have to add 2 to both sides to make this 0. So now we have our 2 factors. Remember, we're just doing the reverse of what we did here. So we went from here, wrote them as factors, and now we're going to go up to our last step and multiply them. So here we wrote them as factors. Our last step is to multiply the factors and set it equal to y. Let me add that. So our 2 factors are x minus 3 and x plus 2. Those were the 2 roots they gave us. And now we're going to multiply out our factors. So using FOIL, I would have x squared for my first term. And then my outside would be plus 2x. My inside would be minus 3x. And then minus 3 times 2 would be negative 6. And then I would combine like terms. These two we can add and get negative x. So to find our equation with roots of 3 and -2, this would be the equation. If we put that in the calculator to check, it should have x-intercept at 3 and -2. Okay, so make sure you take a minute, understand how we did this in reverse. Okay, now I want you just to try example 1, example 2. Go ahead and try to work through those steps that I just talked about, and try example 1 and example 2, and then bring it back. Okay, for example 1, our steps again, our first step is to, once we have the roots, is to write them as solutions. So here's my first step. Now we're going to write them as factors. And now we're going to multiply them out. So whenever you have 3 items that you're multiplying, 3 binomials, you first multiply the first 2, then you'll multiply the trinomial by the binomial. And you can use the distributive property like I showed here, or you can use your box method of a 3 by 2. And then again, when you finish, you can use the calculator to check. Put this in the calculator and this in the calculator, and make sure that you're getting that the roots are 2, 3, and -5, and that these two are the same to check your algebra. Our second example, we had to pull out our roots this time. They're given the graph, and we write the equation of the polynomial. So this 0 is at -3, this one is at 0, and this one's at 2. So that's our first step, just writing them down as solutions. Now we're going to, our next step would be to write them as factors. This factor is already set equal to 0, so that was a little less work. That's our first one. Then we want these two to set equal to 0, so I had to add 3 to both sides for this factor and subtract 2 from both sides for this factor. Next, I FOILed these two out, and then multiplied by the x to get my final equation. Okay, if you have a question about any of these steps, please write it over here and make sure you ask me in class. Okay, the last part of our notes is on multiplicity. So the roots that we saw before were all single roots. They had a multiplicity of 1. And that just means how many times is that root. So if you remember from our algebra, our unit, quadratic unit, remember how we talked about how this root was a double root when it touched the graph and bounced off, and it would be one real root, but it is the same root twice. So that now you have that definition, and you'll have to recognize that in the graph and from the equation. So anytime you see the word double root, it means that root bounces off the x-axis and goes back up. And in this graph, you have this double root plus a single root. So you would write those three equations down, and you'd have the first one would be x equals -3 to represent this one, but our double root you would write twice. Then you would have two factors. This would factor, when you have the factors, that would be x minus 1, and so would that. So you can rewrite that as x minus 1 squared. This factor, when we set it equal to 0, would be x plus 3. Okay. So two things to remember here. A double root is when it bounces off the x-axis, and then when you go to write the factor, you end up having a square because the item will be twice. Our last part here is on triple roots, and this is like a twist in what it looks like in the graph. It still goes through the graph, but it looks like a twist anytime you see that. That's called a triple root. So all our odd roots would go through the graph. This would be a single root, and this would be a triple. But our even would always bounce off the graph. So if it's a double root or a root of 4 to the 4th power, it's going to bounce off the graph. But our triple and our any odd root, triple would go through the graph, and a single goes through the graph, but the triple has a little twist in here. When you see that twist, it means that root is 3 times, and you would use the to the 3rd power when you write that factor. Okay, one last part for your homework tonight, and that's practicing for the quiz 1. Remember, our quiz is next class, and I want you to try these problems. They're very similar to the one we did in class. Go ahead and try them, and we'll check them and go over them before we have the quiz in class on next class. I hope you have a great night, and I'll be after school if you need help.